I'm delighted to be here today to share a few thoughts and ideas about this big challenge of how to match up concerns about low, zero emissions with wider concerns about sustainability, which is exactly the right challenge, it has to be said. I noticed that there was a sort of sense of this is 1 year on from the things that you were discussing last year, and how much has changed in that year is often a very significant factor to be taken into account. One thing that I'm sure didn't escape your attention was the Department for Transport indicated that emissions from transportation here in the UK had actually now, as a total percentage of our greenhouse gas emissions, had increased to 26% of our total emissions, which is just slightly more than emissions from our electricity supply system. So we're talking about a big game here. You'll also have followed a lot of the announcements from the OEMs, which I think are fairly significant. The one that caught my attention was BMW's decision to raise its total investment in R&D on batteries from 6.2 billion euros to more than 7 billion euros. This is a place where there is now very big money going into trying to crack some of these particular answers. Now, I'm a layperson in this discussion. I follow all these debates with great interest. I wrote a book 5 years ago called The World We Made, where I had to give a couple of indications where I thought the balance between the internal combustion engine, electric vehicles, and hydrogen would take us by the year 2050. That's a really stupid game to get into, but since the book was about the world that we would be living in 2050, I didn't really have any alternative but to take a bit of a punt on that one. And as I did my research for that, it pretty quickly became clear to me, even as a sort of layperson in this area, that this issue about battery technology would completely dominate the debate about the speed with which the internal combustion engine was seen off, as most people in my community believe it needs to be. And it came down very quickly to the speed with which we'd be able to move away from our current dependence on lithium-ion. I had a few very exciting advocates for what would happen when we moved to lithium-air batteries, and then some even more excited protagonists for the notion that we had to get rid of the conventional idea about batteries completely and move as fast as possible towards supercapacitors. Now, I think there are probably a few sustainability issues associated with supercapacitors as well, but I must say I got a little frisson of pleasure as I was reading last week's New Scientist, because obviously when you've written a book and you've said things are going to happen, when they do happen, you sort of think, oh, am I smart or what? Anyway, this hasn't quite happened yet, but I couldn't help but spot this little article. A chance finding could speed the development of electric cars and phones that will be able to charge in just minutes. Whilst attempting to develop water-absorbing plastics called hydrophilic polymers for use in contact lenses, UK company Super Dielectrics inadvertently created an excellent supercapacitor. It stores energy by maintaining an electric field within the material. The firm has now used this material to create prototypes of a new kind of supercapacitors for use in automotives. The hope is that it will be able to store more energy for its volume and charge faster than any lithium-ion battery, which currently take hours to charge, and it'll wear out over a much longer period of time. Now, I have no idea whether there's any merit in that or not, but you kind of like the serendipity of a couple of people looking at contact lenses and coming up with something that could be really significant in the field of battery technology. That is the amazing thing about science today. But, of course, behind all of that lies this real question about urgency and speed of change. Not the fact that change will come, and will come increasingly rapidly, but how fast is it going to need to come? And that's really what I want to try and tease out with you in my little presentation to start with, because the reality is that when you look at the science of climate change, there are really no counterfactuals at all from the dominant hypothesis that we are seeing an accelerating pattern of different feedback loops in the climate. And this acceleration is what is now giving scientists, climatologists, real deep cause for concern. And if you've ever stared into the eyes of a climatologist, particularly those that work in the Arctic or the Antarctic, late at night, usually after a couple of drinks, you will see real, raw fear about what is beginning to come back from the planet in terms of our empirical understanding of these change processes. And I'm sure that being good engineers and scientists yourselves, you will have spotted some of this feedback loop stuff going on earlier in the year when the UK was exposed to what became known rapidly in the press as the beast from the east. Now, this really wasn't a cold beast. I know it turned up as a cold beast in terms of our weather for a week or so, but that would be completely to misrepresent what was actually going on climatologically. Because we only got that intense cold spell because of the hot beast that is raging in the Arctic. And every now and then you got a few snippets of some real climate science between the story about people being affected by the beast from the east, which indicated to us that it is this incredibly accelerated process of change in the Arctic that is now causing all of these climate perturbations in the northern hemisphere, particularly disruptions in the polar vortex, as the configuration of the different wind patterns around the Arctic is now changing, sucking in warm air, and of course pushing out the cold air that we then got a whole bellyful of. For one 6-day period, average temperatures in the Arctic were 25 degrees centigrade above the normal seasonal average. That is a pretty extraordinary weather outlier, if you like, indicating that some of the feedback loops in terms of where we are today in the Arctic is now, these loops are now impacting on us. So I'm going to try this little slide on you, knowing that you'll all, as good betting people, I'm sure, be able to read this fairly quickly and also share with me some of my concerns. These are the 3 temperature variables that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change plays around with all the time. What do we need to do to keep average temperatures below those 3 thresholds? 1.5 degrees centigrade, which emerged as the new consensus of the Paris Agreement. 2 degrees centigrade, which is what we've been talking about really for the last 10 years. And then a 3 degrees centigrade outlier. And what it shows you here is the chance. What is the percentage chance today of us staying below these 3 temperature thresholds? And it's all based on work done by the Intergovernmental Panel. They have an extremely smart and very simple way now of calculating the available budget for humankind. How much more can we put into the atmosphere and still hope to stay below either 1.5, 2, or 3? And it's a very simple set of calculations they make. They know exactly what the loading in the atmosphere will do in terms of the warming, the radiation effect. They know how that radiation effect turns into average temperature increases, blah, blah, blah. So it's extremely robust science, first promulgated by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change. This is the carbon budgets here. Okay, now, the IPCC, in a rather interesting way, has always used statistical probability to try and explain what the chances are, because in truth, we don't know as much about this as we might like to. As climate scientists will say, we've never cooked a planet before. So you have to kind of have a bit of a rule of thumb going on here. So the best bet here is a 66% chance, not so good on 50%, not so good on 33%. I'm about to get on a plane later today. Yes, I know, greenies do use planes, it's okay. If I was told that I had a 66% chance of getting to my destination as I boarded the plane, I would be quite grumpy. But we are apparently perfectly happy to go with best bet 66% probability that we can avoid these various temperature increases. Anyway, take today's budget, 36 billion tons of CO2 or net greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere every year. If you calculate on a business as usual basis, because we're sort of getting better, but not really, about reducing that annual quantum, 36 billion tons. If you take that and project it out into the future, the IPCC tells us that if you want to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, and trust me, we do, we really do, then at a 66% chance of staying below that threshold, we have precisely 4 years to get things sorted. At 66%. Now, if you're a betting person and you're happy to go with rather dodgier odds, at a 33% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade, we've got 15 years. I don't think people today, even in the science community, understand the urgency that we're talking about at the moment. I just don't believe people have internalized this incredible story about the speed with which these impacts in the climate are now moving through different global climate systems and impacting in increasingly dramatic ways on people's lives today. So the first thing to say is this urgency has to be taken on board now by everybody involved in seeking to bring about solutions to these issues. I'll leave that. It's a bit gloomy, isn't it, really? But it does up the ante when you think about the scale and the quality of the innovation that we now need to make this change. There was a subheading I saw in the brochure for this conference that said, better get this right, is sustainability achievable in the automotive sector? Well, it had better be, looking at this kind of stuff. Okay, now, climate is one thing. I have talked mostly about climate because it is the one that impacts most on the work that you do at the APC. But of course, as scientists have been pointing out to us, climate is just one of these huge planetary boundaries that we're playing with at the moment in terms of the impact of the global economy on different natural systems. And this is the work that was first done now 11 years ago by the Stockholm Resilience Center, by Johan Rockström and scientists all around the world now, particularly in the US, Australia, and elsewhere, looking at these 9 different planetary boundaries, seeking to define as accurately as possible what they call a safe operating space, the space within which humankind can live and prosper and do everything that we want to do safely. And the hypothesis behind this is simple. If we stay within these planetary boundaries, for all 9 of them, then the prospects for humankind are pretty good. It doesn't mean to say we'll have a really smart economy. We might end up still having a really stupid economy, especially as we'll probably have more than our quota of really stupid politicians. But nonetheless, it does mean that we're not going to tip humankind over into this space beyond these thresholds in all of these different systems. You'll be familiar with some of these. This one here, for instance, stratospheric ozone depletion, probably the best bit of news that we've had in terms of all the wonderful insights into how natural systems work, because we did spot what was happening to the ozone layer. We did introduce a whole set of scientific innovation and political responses. We did get a treaty agreed with the Montreal Protocol, and hey presto, in about 70 years from the time the Montreal Protocol was signed, the ozone layer will be back to where it was before we started putting those ozone-depleting gases into the atmosphere. Roughly a 70-year process of restitution for the ozone layer itself. But let's not knock good news when we've got it. So you can see here, pretty safe. This is the whole story about phosphorus and nitrogen. We are way outside any safe operating space in terms of our abuse of the nitrogen cycle. And this is causing unbelievable problems with hundreds of dead zones around the world's oceans caused by the runoff of fertilizers from intensive agriculture. Some of them, they don't know how to define. Atmospheric loading, not sure how to deal with that. Here's biosphere, the whole story about biodiversity. And there's climate change, and you can see climate change now, just about to get out of the green zone into the dodgy zone, and beyond the dodgy zone, there's only red. And guess what we're going to have to do to bring it back? If we get into the red, what are we going to have to do to get that concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere back into a safe space? The geoengineering challenges are astonishing. So this is a big deal for everybody, to try and work out these planetary boundaries and how we need to configure our economic and social expectations against some of the hard-edged physical realities of what we're currently doing to our natural world. And that's why people are now thinking increasingly about a wider picture. In 2015, same year as the Paris Agreement, great year for sustainability, all a bit kind of let down in 2016 when odd political events happened. But the Sustainable Development Goals are essentially a way of looking at the integrated approach to social, economic, environmental, and governance challenges, and making sure we don't make progress in one area by trading off progress in other areas. So from a straight concern about automotive technologies, emissions, air quality, and so on, it's perfectly clear that we would be looking at good health and well-being, growing concerns about the impact of vehicle emissions on health, of course. We'd be looking at affordable and clean energy, at climate action, and a host of other things, partnerships for these goals, responsible consumption and production, and so on. We are beginning to think about these things in much more holistic ways, which is really hugely encouraging. These have to be delivered by 2030. Every country on Earth has signed up to the 169 individual targets that nestle under each of these 17 big picture goals. And it's quite important from time to time to remember that as we all pursue our own, often quite forensic contribution to progress for humankind, that we are just part of a massive effort now being made to improve the lot of humankind today and prospects for humankind tomorrow. That's the wider context that we're all in. Climate change inevitably dominates this, because climate change is by far the biggest threat to any prospects we might have of delivering goals of this kind. It is literally apart from nuclear warfare, of course that does crop up from time to time these days, apart from that, it is the one threat to the future of humankind, which has been described as an existential threat, as in it could put at risk the entire prospect for our civilization as a whole. So that's where you all fit. I just thought I'd end with a tiny reminder that some people are in an even sharper place than you are. This is a little slide that I was introduced to recently from, actually it doesn't attribute it, it's an IATA slide from the aviation industry. And I know you've got some sort of residual interest in aviation, but this is the comparison if we are having a conference today about what are the prospects for massive reductions in emissions from aviation. This is the sort of data point they'd be looking at. Here we are today. Aviation, roughly 2% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. Because every other sector in the economy, including automotive, obviously, is now planning a kind of downward trajectory between starting in 2025, thereabouts. By the time we get through to 2050, emissions from aviation will be contributing 20% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're in aviation, this is an even more uncomfortable place than it is in the automotive sector. And actually, as they will tell you, these figures are not really correct. This is 2% based on direct climate-related emissions. So the CO2, primarily. We now know a lot more about aviation, and we know a lot more about the impact of these emissions in the upper atmosphere. And the total radiative forcing story, which looks at the role of nitrogen oxides in the upper atmosphere and so on, tells us that, in fact, this is closer to 4%. So by 2050, 40% of total global greenhouse gas emissions would come from aviation, on a business as usual extrapolation. So, they've got a tough story. You've got a tough story too, and I just want to end by reminding you all that you are in a hot seat, to say the least, technologically and in terms of innovation, and a seat that is actually getting hotter and hotter by the month. So all I can really do is wish you well as you help reduce the average temperatures in the seats that you're all sitting in. Thank you.